I'm going to cover chapter 6, 13, and then I'm going to cover some questions from homework number 3. So starting with chapter 6, we are taking the old closed economy equation of output equals consumption plus government plus investment. And then when we open the economy, we also add possible export. So if we have too much output, we can sell it to other countries. If we don't have enough output, we can buy from other countries, and that's import. And so we can move the import to this side, and the export minus the import is called net export. And now we can reorganize this equation to be net export is equal to y minus c minus g minus I. Now this part here, y minus c minus g, happens to be saving. And so basically we're converting the IS equation to being NX is equal to savings minus investment. And so we can see that the net export is a consequence of trade, and the saving minus investment is capital. So we have trade flows equal capital flows. So if we have more exports than imports, then we have a positive trade balance. And at the same time, savings must be larger than investment, and so we're going to have negative capital account. And so capital will flow out of the country because we have more capital than we need for our own investments, so we will be investing in another country. Now we can put this equation on a diagram, and the savings will be constant because they're controlled by the real economy, and on the y-axis we put the real interest rate. And so the savings will not be influenced by the interest rate. That's why they're vertical, they're fixed. They're controlled by the consumption, by the government budget, so y minus c minus g. And the investment curve is going to be influenced by the real interest rate. Now the key assumption in an open economy is that our interest rate is going to equalize to the world interest rate R star. And so we are not in control of our own real interest rate once we open the economy to capital flows, because if our interest rate is higher, then capital will flow in to get the interest rate, and if it's lower, capital will flow out to get a higher interest rate elsewhere. And so this is going to be, let's say that this is the initial saving level, and let's say that the initial R star level is here. Now, if we were a closed economy, we would have the equilibrium here. But now, since we're not controlling the interest rate, we have a different level of investment. And so investment is going to be here, and the difference between them is going to be the net exports. And then if we have a change in the world interest rate, we will have, so this is going to be 1, this is going to be 2. We will have an even lower level of investment, I2, and then we will have a bigger net export 2. And so the world interest rate is going to affect the difference between saving and investment. And as a result of that, it will affect the net exports. And so in this framework, the fiscal policy at home will be to change S, mostly by increasing or decreasing the government expenditure. The fiscal policy abroad is going to work through change of R star, and we could have also an investment demand change, which will shift the curve itself. So those are the things that can change on this in this framework. Now, in order to move to the next framework, we need to define the exchange rate. And the next framework will take both the S and the I and group them together into one instead of having to plot them separately. It will plot them as one function, and we will see that. But first we need to define the exchange rate, and so the nominal exchange rate is going to be E, and the real exchange rate is going to be epsilon. Now, the nominal exchange rate is how many foreign units of currencies are needed to buy one home unit of currency. So this would be the US dollar in the denominator. How many foreign units of capital are required to buy one US dollar? That would be the nominal exchange rate. Accordingly, the real interest rate is going to be the nominal interest rate divided by the price abroad multiplied by the price at home, and that will give us the exchange rate in units of consumption. So it would give us the how many units abroad are required to buy one unit at home. And so that would be the exchange rate in real terms. And so the dynamics are that if the real exchange rate goes up, the result of that would be that our goods become more expensive relative to the goods abroad. And so our export will go down and our import will go up, or in other words, the net export will go down. And so basically we can look at the net export function as a function of the real exchange rate. And so that's what we do in the next framework, where we look at net exports, the real exchange rate. And now, instead of separating saving and investment, we have a saving and investment line. So S minus R I function of R star. So that's our net exports from the investment side. And then we have the net export from the trade side. And so now we get an equilibrium of the real exchange rate, let's say E1, epsilon 1, and here we have net exports epsilon 1. And so this is a framework that relates the two sides of the IS equation as we defined it before. So we rewrote the IS equations in terms of net exports, savings, and investment. Now net exports from the trade side is a function of the real interest rate, and the saving minus investment is a function of the world interest rate. And so we can now look at the consequences of that for policy. So in terms of fiscal policy, we would use a change in S to affect the difference between S minus I R star, and that will give us a combination of a real interest rate and net export. So that would be how we affect fiscal policy. And then we have fiscal policy abroad, that will work through R star. It will affect us through R star, then through the S minus I of R star, and that will again give us a combination of real interest rate and net exports. And then we have again a change in the investment demand function, a shift. So that would be a shift of I R, and again that would change the S minus I R and give us a new equilibrium. Last, we have trade policy, that shifts the NX epsilon line, and so that will change the epsilon, but will not change the net export. And the reason for that is that S minus I is not changing due to the change of the shift of the NX. So the S minus I is a vertical line. It's not a function of the real interest rate. And because it's vertical, all the shift of the NX curve would do is only change the epsilon, only change the real interest rate. So trade policy doesn't do much for changing the balance of trade in this framework. The next question that we're going to ask is what determines the nominal interest rate, or more accurately, its fluctuations. And so if we invert the previous formula for real interest rate as a function of nominal, we can do the opposite and say that the nominal interest rate is the real interest rate times the prices abroad divided by the price at home. And so the changes in the nominal interest rate, the percent change, is going to be the change in the real interest rate, percent change plus the percent change in the price abroad, plus or minus actually the percent change in the price at home. Now let's assume that we don't have any changes in the real interest rate, so this will basically become the difference between the inflation abroad and the inflation at home. So the nominal interest rate will fluctuate based on the difference between the inflation rates in both countries. So this sums up chapter 6, and now let's go to chapter 13, the Mundell Fleming model, and it's basically a version of the ISLM, which means that we're talking about short term, which means that prices are fixed. And again, the usual assumption is that the interest rate at home would have to be equal to the world interest rate or the interest rate abroad. And so the IS is, as usual, the consumption as a function of y minus t plus I as a function of r star plus G plus net exports. This time we're going to use the nominal interest rate because the prices are fixed. And for the LM curve, we're going to use the money supply, M over P, and P again is fixed, is going to be equal to money demand, which is a function of the world interest rate and output. And this can be also kind of inverted to find the output as a function of money and world interest rate, because the prices are fixed. And so we can put this these two equations on the diagram of the international open economy ISLM framework. And so let's do that. So in this case, we're not going to use output versus interest rate. Instead, we're going to use the nominal exchange rate. And so LM is going to be vertical because it's not a function of the exchange rate. So it stays fixed for any exchange rate. And the IS curve is a function of the exchange rate because we have the net exports, which are a function of the exchange rate. And then we're going to have an equilibrium. We're going to get a certain exchange rate as a result of that, and a certain output as a result of that. And now we have two options of how to deal with such a world. We can choose between two options for policy. One is we can choose a floating exchange rate. In this framework, we can run our fiscal policy, monetary policy, and not care about the exchange rate. The exchange rate will be just a result of whatever policy we decide to pursue. The second option is that we choose a fixed exchange rate. In that case, this will require us to actively, whatever we do, we have to also take into account the exchange rate and make sure that it remains fixed. And this will force us to use monetary policy to only pursue keeping the exchange rate fixed. So let's look at these two options one by one. So the first option we said was floating exchange rate. And so let's say that we want to move the IS curve. So this would include fiscal or trade policy. The problem with this is that this is the result of that is the only thing that will change is the exchange rate. So this will not do anything for the real economy. It will only change the exchange rate. And the reason why it's easy to see that on the diagram is that the LM is vertical. And so because of that, if you move the IS curve to a new level, the output doesn't change. The only thing that happens is that you move from the initial exchange rate to a new exchange rate. And the reason why that happens is that the IS in the home economy will increase the interest rate in the home economy. That will cause money to flow in to get the higher interest rate than the interest rate abroad. That will cause the exchange rate to go up, which will cause the net exports to go down, which will cause the IS curve to go down. So basically, the only thing that that changes in the internal economy. So if this is the closed economy model. So this is what happens inside the economy that causes us to not have any result. This is just for intuition, but you can see directly from the diagram why this is happening here. So because the LM curve is vertical, we will not get any change in output. So this is fiscal policy. Now, monetary LM shift, which basically can only happen here by increasing the money supply. This will cause an increase in output and a decrease in the interest rate. So again, using the same diagram, if we shift the LM curve over here, we get a new equilibrium of bigger output and lower interest rate. lower exchange rate. So this is the first option, the option of floating exchange rate. Now let's look at the other option, which is fixed. So if we're choosing the option of fixed exchange rate, now we will need to use monetary policy is going to be dedicated to keep the exchange rate fixed. And to see that, we can look at the diagram again. So let's say that we have an initial IS curve and an initial LM curve. Now let's say that we run some fiscal policy that changes the IS curve. So as a result of that, we get a change in the exchange rate, but we said that we are not willing to accept any change in the exchange rate. And so in order to keep the exchange rate fixed, we will need to move the LM curve here to keep the exchange rate fixed. And now we get this increase in output as a result. So once we are choosing this option of a fixed exchange rate, basically we have no free monetary policy. We can't just move the money supply at will, because that will change the exchange rate. But now the monetary policy has to track or follow the fiscal policy, and now the fiscal policy or trade policy that move the IS work. So in the first option, when we choose a floating exchange rate, only the monetary policy works. Here, basically the fiscal policy works because it's done in collaboration or together with a monetary policy that follows along. So this covers chapters 6 and 13, and good luck on the final.